Some of you have known me for, say, almost 20 years, and some of you are people I hope to make friends with today. I converted to Zoroastrianism in the 1990s in a ceremony conducted by Ahura Mazda in Gothenburg. It was a fantastic moment and a really dramatic and life-changing experience for me to publicly convert to Zoroastrianism. And I definitely understand why you would want to go through this initiation ceremony. And it's going to mean a lot to you. I'm here today to speak on the person Zarathustra himself and his ideas. One of the advantages of converting as a Westerner is that I had to study Zarathustra from scratch. I wasn't told any stories about Zarathustra as a child. He was not part of any specific nationalist agenda or anything like that at all. I became interested in Zarathustra in the 1980s simply by studying the subject of philosophy. And by reading philosophy, one of the things I discovered was that traditional philosophy in the West is built on a big misconception. And that misconception is the idea that thinking started with the Greeks 2,500 years ago, and before the Greeks there was nobody on the planet who thought. Which is of course a ridiculous idea, and a racist one as well, which is why it's really disgusting. The idea that the Greeks began to think, and that thinking starts with the Greeks, is really a very European and Eurocentric idea, based on the old colonial idea that European people are somehow superior to other people, which is of course a ridiculous idea. To begin with, the fact they construct a history that's a lie just shows that they're rather inferior more than superior. So I became interested in what philosophy is and where the idea originated from. So I started by going to the Greeks themselves. And it's interesting that to the Greeks, there was no such concept as Europe. Europe did not exist. It's a very late modern concept constructed about 400 years ago. To the Greeks, there were civilized people to the east and to the south of Greece. And Greece was the last bastion of civilization at the very north. And north of the Greeks, there were only barbarians and other awful people who didn't even count. So the Greek worldview consisted of a relationship between the small and very few Greeks in the north and their communication with the Egyptians, the Babylonians, and the Persians. And to the Greeks, the Egyptians, the Babylonians, and the Persians were civilization, and the Greeks were the last little force, the defendants of civilization against the barbarians of the north. This was the Greek worldview. So this is very interesting because we have mistakenly credited the Greeks with invented something that in the Greek language is called philosophia. Philosophia is two words in Greek meaning the love, which is philo, of wisdom, which is sophia. So what the Greeks began to do 2,500 years ago was that when they had some time left, they would sit under trees and talk to each other about reality, talk to each other about existence, and talk to each other about the conditions of life. What was life all about? What was the right thing? What was the wrong thing to do with your life? They had the luxury of doing this under their trees in Greece, but they didn't get the concept from nowhere. They inherited the idea of philosophy from somewhere else. And this is where I began to study Iranian philosophy. What I'm interested in is not Iranian religion. I'm interested in Iranian philosophy. And what really upset me was that when I traveled throughout Asia, to people in Asia, there are three really rich cultural traditions in Asian history. One of them is the Indian tradition, the second one is the Chinese tradition, and the third one is the Iranian tradition. And what I discovered in the 1980s was that the Indians and the Chinese were very good at selling themselves to the West as rich cultural traditions. So Westerners became interested in Indian history and Indian thinking. They became interested in Chinese history and Chinese thinking for the very same reason, but somehow they associated the Iranians with Ayatollah Khomeini and some other bad guys. They completely missed out on the third really rich cultural tradition coming from Asia, namely the Iranian. And here was the interesting thing. I had read Nietzsche before, and I'd read Also sprach Zarathustra, and I'd also learned that Nietzsche did not use the historical figure of Zarathustra at all. He made up a figure that he called Zarathustra. Ironically, Nietzsche himself said that was not the case. In a later work called Ecce Homo, Nietzsche wrote that he was interested in the character of Zarathustra because Zarathustra was the originator of ethics. He was the first human being ever to formulate a system of ethics that other people could use in their lives, which is exactly what Zarathustra did. So I decided that the conception that Nietzsche had used Zarathustra as an invented figure was wrong. Nietzsche used Zarathustra as the historical person he really was. If anything, Nietzsche himself was a Zoroastrian. I then studied Iranian philosophy, which begins, you study Zarathustra first and foremost as the originator of Iranian philosophy. And here comes the interesting thing. In Germany in the 19th century, the Germans discovered there was a rich traditional text coming from Iran. And this traditional text is called the Avesta. And they very soon realized that some parts of the Avesta had the same original author and was also a text that was much older than the rest of the Avesta. And this text is the Gathas. This is a text that was authored by one and the same person, namely Zarathustra himself. So we could sit down in the 1980s and read Zarathustra himself and discover who was this guy? What was his thoughts? Who was he? And we discover right away that what Zarathustra is doing in the Gathas is that he's constructing a system that he calls Mazda Yasna. Mazda Yasna. You know what the interesting thing is? Yasna is people who love to follow something because of devotion. And Mazda means wisdom. It turns out that the concept of Mazda Yasna that Zarathustra set up 1,200 years before the Greeks even began to think is the original philosophia. The word Mazda Yasna means philosophy. Zarathustra did not construct a religion. Zarathustra constructed the original philosophy. He called his teaching philosophy. What we then have done is that we have constructed a religion around this philosophy, which is perfectly fine. We constantly innovate this religion. Wearing white, for example, today on Zarathustra's birthday, is not something that's stated in the Gathas. It's something we as Zoroastrians have invented later, which is perfectly fine. But the original Zarathustra was not concerned with constructing a religion. He was concerned with constructing a philosophy that made sense, that was true, that people could live according to. So what was his philosophy? To begin with, Zarathustra has two terms that he uses again and again. One of them is Ahura, and the other one is Mazda. We have perhaps mistakenly learned to use these two together as one word. And we speak of our God. We say our God is Ahura Mazda. This is not what people did during Zarathustra's era. This is something we have learned to do because we're talking to Muslims, we're talking to Christians, we're talking to Jews, and we're talking to Hindus all the time, and we try to explain our religion to them. But the fact is that Ahura Mazda is rarely used in connection with each other by Zarathustra himself in the Gathas. Rather, he speaks of Ahura separately, and he speaks of Mazda separately. The interesting thing, though, is that for Zarathustra, they're very connected. Because Zarathustra lives in a world with only one substance. He is what is philosophically called a monist. He believes there is only one world, and he's not really interested in any other worlds. He's not interested in heavens. He's not interested in hells. He's not interested in other planets. He's interested in the here and now, where we as human beings live, in one world. But it's a world that can have an endless amount of attributes. We can apply different concepts on this world to understand this world better. And Ahura and Mazda are two concepts that Zarathustra admits that he has invented to understand the world better. So what are Ahura and what Mazda? Ahura is the world as it is. It is what is true. It is how things really are. Zarathustra is not interested in nurturing fantasies. He doesn't tell stories of his imagination. He doesn't make things up. He doesn't speak of the Garden of Eden and Adam had his bone taken out, and then Eve was created. And then suddenly there was a snake there, and the snake fooled Eve to eat a fruit or whatever. There's none of that in the Gathas because Zarathustra doesn't need it, and he's not interested in it. He thinks it only confuses people because he believes that we have the mental capacity to see the world as it is and to accept the world as it is. And it's something we're devoted to doing, and this is a principle called Asha. And Asha is to Zoroastrians as important as the cross is to Christians, as obedience is to Muslims, and as karma is to the Hindus. Asha is at the very essence of what it means to be a Zoroastrian. To live according to Asha is what we want to do day and night as Zoroastrians. And Ahura is the world as it is. Asha is how this world operates. So what is Mazda? Well, Mazda is, according to Zarathustra, the other aspect of reality that he finds endlessly fascinating. It is our human capacity to think. It is wisdom. It is having a sense, making sense of things. If Ahura is nature, then Mazda is culture. And here comes the really interesting thing. It would have been very, very easy for Zarathustra to construct a religion only on being, on existence. And in that case, he would have constructed Ahura Yasna. But he doesn't. What he does, what his brethren in India don't dare to do, what the Brahmin philosophers of India did not do, because in India they're completely obsessed with Ahura. That's what Indian philosophy is. But what's unique about the Iranian philosophy about Zarathustra is that he puts the emphasis on the capacity to think. He puts the emphasis on our capacity to contemplate and react to the world and think about it and then act according to what we think. This is why he calls his philosophy Mazda Yasna and not Ahura Yasna. So Mazda is absolutely central. Another word for Zoroastrianism, and a very good one, is Mazdaism. And if you don't want to focus too much on the person Zarathustra, then you can speak to Westerners, speak of Mazdaism or being a Mazdaist, and it makes absolutely perfect sense. Because we are Mazda Yazni. We are people who worship wisdom. We are people who worship our own capacity to think and to be intelligent and clever. So the world is these two things. It's being and it's mind. This is the essence of Zarathustra's worldview, and everything else he does builds from this. Zarathustra doesn't like to make things more complicated than they have to be, which a lot of philosophers do. So he constructs an ethical system. Why not a moral system? Because morality did not exist at the time of Zarathustra. What I found so intriguing about Zarathustra when I started studying him was that he lived 3,700 years ago. Sometimes people say that Zoroastrianism was the first monotheistic faith. I disagree. There was no such thing as monotheism during the time of Zarathustra. He didn't need monotheism at all. There was a polytheistic religion, a folk religion, that the Iranian tribes of Central Asia shared with the people of India at the time. But Zarathustra was totally opposed to it. He found it demeaning. He said, why would we need all these gods for? We don't need all these gods at all. We have our own capacity to think. So what we should concentrate on is to think right instead of thinking wrongly. Why should we believe in gods that we've apparently just made up for whatever reasons, when we can believe in the world exactly as it is and live according to the world exactly as it is instead? This is the radical message. So he came up, instead of giving people a moral system, instead of giving them 10 commandments that said, you can only do this, you cannot do this, you can only do this, you cannot do this. And have all these rules applied to people and say, this is how you have to live your life, and then regulate people's lives in detail. And if people broke these rules, you threatened them with the judgment day, and they would be banned and sent to hell. Like the Abrahamic religions did much later. No, Zarathustra didn't do that. He was interested in the here and now. He was interested in reality. And instead he gave us an ethical system. He wondered, what is the human condition like at its very, very basics? What does it mean to be a human being? Well, it means to be one animal among many other animals, but an animal who also has the capacity to think and create, which makes us human beings totally different. So he made up an ethical system, and he saw ethics as behavior more than anything. Ethics is always an ethics about behavior, because it's what we do with our bodies that affects the world we live in. He was totally upset with people who would storm into the villages in Central Asia and destroy everything. That upset him a lot in the Gathas. What he loved, those were people who cooperated with each other and together built a civilization where you learned from other people's mistakes, so you didn't have to repeat those mistakes. Instead, you could go on and build a more civilized world. That fascinated Zarathustra. He was interested in creating civilization. I would even claim that he is the first civilizationist in the history of philosophy. He understands how wonderful it is when people get together, to work together, to achieve something creative together. So he realized that there are three things we have to be concerned with. One of them is thought, how we think. Do we think of ourselves as manifestations of Ahura Mazda? Do we realize that we really are Mazda as individuals, and together we create and manifest Mazda thinking? Because that is what we do when we become divine, according to Zarathustra. We are, or at least we should be, the manifestations of Mazda. That's exactly why we are Mazda Yasni. So to think the right thoughts is something that obsesses Zarathustra. But he also realizes that there is speech. As human beings, we communicate with each other. Thinking is another word for speaking to yourself. So speech and thought are completely intertwined with each other. And then he discovered that how we act, our actions, are the third part that we have to consider. What then Zarathustra realized that makes him unique as a thinker is that he understands that these three things interact with each other in a constant feedback loop. We have heard, and it's often translated to English as good thoughts, good words, and good deeds. I actually disagree with that translation. I don't think it captures what the Avesta language tries to say here, what Zarathustra tries to say. What Zarathustra really says is not good, because good is too vague. What he says is constructive or creative. Constructive thoughts result in constructive speech. Constructive speech results in constructive actions. And constructive actions then are feedback to become constructive thoughts. This is why the first thing we do as Zoroastrians who wake up in the morning is to meditate and contemplate. We don't pray. We don't pray to a God and ask that God to give us gifts because we were lazy yesterday. So because we didn't work hard to make any money yesterday, we ask God to give us something. That's what the Christian or Muslim or Hebrew gods do. We don't have a God like that. We realize that we are left to ourselves and our brothers and sisters of our community to create civilization for ourselves. It's what we do with the world, that's what we're responsible for. And we're responsible to nobody else but ourselves. It all returns back to us and about who we are. And this is what Zarathustra meant, really deeply in a philosophical sense. He meant that it's really important when you wake up in the morning and you have a unique possibility to correct your mind. You should re-emphasize your mind to think constructive thoughts. Remove that in your mind which is destructive. Remove that wants to destroy for yourself, that wants to destroy for other people. Remove those, I wouldn't say negative thoughts, I'm saying destructive thoughts. Sometimes it's good to think negative. Sometimes we're in for a storm or something like that. Sometimes there's bad weather coming. Sometimes life is really rough. Then we have negative thoughts. That can also be constructive. What's important is to think constructive thoughts. Because if you think constructively and you concentrate on that when you walk out of the door in the morning, you will meet your brothers and sisters and approach them with a constructive mindset. You will speak constructively. Your constructive speech will influence them to think constructively. So constructivity is something that spreads from one person to the next. And that will then result in constructive actions. And if you then behave constructively the whole day, you will wake up the next morning thinking constructively, urging to be constructive again. Zarathustra was obsessed with this, and this is the big difference between Zarathustra and Indian philosophy, which is the closest relative of Iranian philosophy. The Indian philosophy only has an idea of a circle. The world is always the same. Nothing changes under the sun. Don't think anything is any better or any different today than it was yesterday. And this was something Zarathustra opposed, and which made him, an Iranian philosophy, distinctly different from Indian philosophy. It was that Zarathustra honestly believed we can create a better world. We can create a world that's more constructive. We can create a world for our children that's better than the world we live in ourselves. He believed in civilization. He was a firm believer in civilization. And I insist that he was right. That's why I became a Zoroastrian, and I did not convert to Hinduism. So how is Zarathustra then different from the other systems? I think we need to understand that one of the reasons Zarathustra was such a brilliant thinker 3,700 years ago was because his mind was not infected with a lot of the stupid ideas that came afterwards. There had been no Moses yet. There had been no monotheism yet. There had been no Christ. There had been no St. Paul. There had been no Muhammad. There had been none of those guys. Not even the great Chinese thinkers had been around yet 3,700 years ago. Zarathustra lived in an age where people were settling down from thousands and thousands of years of hectic nomadic life, barely surviving, creating villages instead where they could write language. And by writing language, rather than just speaking, they could store information, and they discovered the wonders of that. The wonders of building civilization and permanent settlements together. This was something wonderful to Zarathustra, and he was in a unique position 3,700 years ago at the birth of written language, being the first philosopher. That's why I find his philosophy so pure, and it's so great in its simplicity, that all I think about when I think of Zarathustra and what came later is, why did all the other guys mess it up? Why did all the other guys that came afterwards have to make it so complicated and so untruthful when Zarathustra really had caught the truth, exactly what it was? His principle of asha is so simple, but it's also so formidable. Because what he's saying is that asha tied to aura is how the world works. The truth about the world. It's what we today call science. The scientific mindset. I'm not interested in fairy tales. I'm not interested in lies. I'm interested in the world as it is. And I'm fascinated with the world. A scientist is a proper Zoroastrian. But asha is also connected to Mazda. It's also connected to our mind. Asha is also an ethical principle. And the ethical principle, asha vahishta in this case, is to live according to asha. To live a truthful life, to see the world for what it is, and then understanding that we can affect the world as human beings. Understanding we can use our minds and in extension our bodies to affect the world as it is and create a better world for ourselves. That's exactly the ethical principle of asha. So asha is both. When we realize that Zarathustra speaks of Ahura and he speaks of Mazda, we also realize that asha is both science, the world as it is, but it's also asha as an ethical principle, which is a fantastic principle. We don't need commandments. We don't need rule books. Zoroastrians are probably the most peaceful people on the planet. They commit less crime than anybody else does. We don't need it. We are evidence. The Zoroastrian community has existed for 3,700 years without rules. But we don't need rules because we learn that if we live in accordance with the truth, with how the world really is, and we're truthful to each other, we don't need rules. We don't need judges. We don't need the concept of sin. We are not sinners. We don't need forgiveness. If we make a mistake, we're willing to pay the price for that mistake ourselves. We take it on ourselves to pay the price for our mistakes, and we realize that we make the mistakes only because we're thinking destructive thoughts and we're speaking destructive words. So we say, okay, I was destructive today. I had a destructive mindset. The world didn't come out the way it should have come out. Okay, I won't repeat that mistake tomorrow. Tomorrow I'll wake up and decide to devote enough time to get a constructive mindset and then move on. We leave the past behind. That's a very, very Nietzschean, Spinozist, Zoroastrian concept. So I think it's very important for us to understand the misconceptions here. I said at the beginning of my little speech that it was great for me to come into the Zoroastrian tradition as an outsider, because I didn't have to take a lot of luggage with me. So what do I see as the biggest problem today? I think the biggest problem today is not Zoroastrianism in relation to Eastern thought. That's the easy one. Even Chinese historians today are willing to admit that Bodhidharma, the founder of Chan philosophy in China, which later became Zen in Japan, the founder of Chan philosophy some 1200 years ago in China, Bodhidharma, was not a prince from southern India, as some Chinese historians have claimed, because there's not a single trace of any prince called Bodhidharma in India. Bodhidharma was likely a trader from Sogdia, a Persian province in Central Asia. And that is exactly why years before I knew that, I was fascinated with the striking similarities between Zoroastrian thinking in Iran and Zen and Chan thinking in China and India. So, what we realize today is that Zoroastrianism is a long philosophical tradition that's welcomed with open arms in China and India and Asia. That's not a problem. They like to reconnect Iranian philosophy with the old, strong, proud traditions of Iranian and Chinese thinking, where Zoroastrianism fits perfectly. A Zoroastrian can easily have a really intelligent conversation with a Brahmanist from India, with a Zen philosopher from Japan, or with a Taoist or a Chan person from China. That's a natural connection for us as Zoroastrians, to connect with Eastern philosophy. And we should take our rightful place within Eastern philosophy and claim that Iranian philosophy, as Zoroastrianism, is at least as strong and as impressive and as important for humanity as the Indian and Chinese philosophies are. But the problem we have is that we're constantly being compared to what I call the Abrahamic faiths that came out of the Middle East: Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. Because honestly, we have very little, if anything, in common with it. I don't mean to speak down on people who have an Abrahamic conviction. That's fine with me. That's not my intention at all. I'm not a warmonger in any way. I want to be peaceful. But I think Zarathustra, probably the most misunderstood human being ever, and his brilliant philosophy deserves a more fair treatment than it has been treated. And instead of escaping who we are, instead of escaping Zarathustra's unique and fantastic teaching, and trying to disguise it as some form of primitive Abrahamic faith, which is what Westerners have tried to do with Zoroastrianism the past 200 years, I think we need to wake up and say, no, that's enough. That's not true. That's not who Zarathustra was. That's not the teaching he gave us. That's not the lives we live. And that's not the worldview Zoroastrians have had for the past 3,700 years. Because we are a religion without sins, without commandments, without rule books. Instead, we constantly create and recreate and co-create our society in our religion. That's what we do as Zoroastrians. And I think it's very, very important to see the difference here. Because what the Abrahamic faiths have done is that they've created a God, a monotheistic God, who's totally separate from humanity. The idea is Plato's idea in Greek philosophy. Plato was the really anti-Zoroastrian thinker, if anybody was. My favorite among the Greeks is Heraclitus, who was Plato's worst enemy. And Heraclitus was really a very Iranian thinker among the Greeks. And Plato is the one who became popular because the Christians made sure he became popular. So what did Plato teach? Plato teach that these are two worlds. He taught a system called dualism. He said that God and humanity are totally separate from each other. And even within us as human beings, this is the separation. There's a part of us human beings that belongs to humanity and the physical world, and that's the body. And there's another part inside of us that belongs to God, and that's the soul. To Plato, it was important to keep soul and body separate. And this is what Abrahamic religions essentially have done. What they then did was that the soul was besmirched. The soul became dirty. The soul fell. That's why sin was invented. Starting with the Garden of Eden, Eve and Adam opposed God. They were naughty children. They did not behave the way God wanted them to. Sin came into the world. The soul became dirty. And sooner or later, this soul has to be cleaned so that humans can again connect with God. This is the Abrahamic idea of what religion is. It's reconnecting human beings to God. And they have three different ways of doing this. Judaism is one way, Christianity had another way with salvation, and Islam is a third way, which is with blind obedience. The problem is, this dualism, even if the world was dualistic, the problem is, what kind of medium do these entities communicate through? If we live in two separate worlds that are totally isolated from each other, how come we even talk to each other? This is a question that dualists have never been able to solve. You know why? Because there is no soul separate from the body. The soul was invented to control people. Because if we fooled people to believe they had a soul that was separate from the body, they would feel guilty about it. They will feel the soul be dirty. They would be a perfect market to market the religion where they have to get forgiveness for their sins, which means they have to pay priests to do that for them, to connect them with God. Zarathustra didn't even know these ideas. He didn't react to these ideas. He's older than any of these ideas were. He would have been terribly upset if somebody would have come along 1,000 years after him and told people this as a message and said, why? Why are you doing this? This is completely unnecessary. Because in Zarathustra's world, he's not interested in constructing this rule book and in saving this relationship. To Zarathustra, God and humanity cannot be disconnected. They are one and the same thing, totally in connection with each other. That's the beauty of his message. This is why we have to oppose dualism, and we have to explain to people and say, no, I am a Zoroastrian, but I'm not an Abrahamic. I'm not a Muslim, I'm not a Christian, I'm not a Judaist, I don't even share their beliefs. On the fundamental level, where the very concept of religion starts, I beg to differ. Because to me, there is only one world, and the world is not dirty, it's not sinful, it's beautiful. It's an amazing arena, the arena that Ahura created for Mazda to materialize, to become Ahura Mazda, one unity. And we are a part in this. We are not only human beings, we are divine beings. Zarathustra's idea for us was to make us realize in this universal message for all mankind, to make us realize that we all have enormous potential by seeing the potential inside ourselves and then seeing the potential when we connect with other people and together we create something truly amazing. We, not only, if the world before us could manifest Ahura. We have arrived in this world as human beings to manifest Mazda. And thereby, the world can become both Ahura and Mazda. We can manifest Ahura Mazda. That is what we're set to do as Mazdaisti. And that's where I'd like to finish today. So, stand up for monism, stand up for Zoroastrianism, and the next time somebody comes along and say, so you belong to that sort of primitive form of Islam, whatever, you just tell them, no, I don't. Rather point to Eastern philosophy and say, this is in this tradition that we belong, and we have a very proud position to defend with an amazing philosopher that gave us a unique teaching 3,700 years ago, and is still the best teaching ever given to mankind on how we should live our lives. That's where I'm at. Now you know why I'm Zoroastrian.